I wanted now to move on to talk about your views, effectively, of the morality of the show. This is the last third of your book, and while you are insistent on the need for reform to lift productivity growth, to make room for some of these great social reforms, such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme, I don't think I've ever seen you so pessimistic about the broader culture. And this, again, is not picking on a political party, but the role of big companies in financing campaigns against governments, the role of very wealthy business people in getting elected by being able to outspend others in their own campaigns, the role of the media. What's going on? Why are things looking so crook?
Well, you say you've never seen me this pessimistic, but you're a young man. I started writing...
Oh, shucks.
I started writing about the need for Australia to get rid of protection.
Yeah.
I think my first published article was probably about 69
right, yeah.
on that. So I was fairly depressed in the 70s, and at that time, and Kim Anderson, my colleague now, then at the ANU, now at the University of Adelaide, and I did a book on Australian protection. We actually did the work in the early 80s, and that's pretty pessimistic. It's very clear about where we should go.
And it took at least a decade.
But it's not very optimistic about us getting there. But we did have the reform era, which shows that it's possible.
Yeah.
And then we've reverted, and some parts of the change back in political culture to the pre-reform era have taken us further back than we were. And the new thing is the completely uninhibited willingness of interested groups with barrows to push to put money into the political process to get outcomes.
So it's not just the lobbying, it's putting the money in. Is this political donations plus paid advertisements?
Paid advertisements, and the first big example of it was the campaign against work choices. And whatever you think about work choices, all of those ads about whinging Wendy weren't about rational discussion of the issues. It was investing in the influencing of public opinion. Now, it got a result, and if you think work choices went too far, and I think, like Tony Abbott, I think that it did go too far. But whatever you think about the outcome, when you are using money, in this case trade union money, to influence opinion, not through appeals to the national interest, not through appeals to the actual effects of something on incomes, but those very emotional appeals. You're treading into new territory. Well, since then, that's become the norm, and we had that huge campaign continuing on one over a long period of time against carbon pricing from affected industries, against the mineral tax, against
the fringe benefits tax,
the gambling reforms. Even the pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical companies were threatening to
run a campaign. Everyone knew what running a campaign meant by then.
By then, so it's made change harder because now the business campaigns against things they didn't like became very big under the Labor government. But these things will be used against a Conservative government as well. Now, at the launch of Dog Days in Canberra, Malcolm Turnbull pointed out quite fairly that there have been such campaigns in the past, and he recalled the campaign against bank nationalisation in '49. So Malcolm's right. That had some similarities.
They were self-interested to an extent to the banks.
Now, I actually think that we avoided a bullet by not nationalising our banks back then, but still, you did have that very heavy investment in the political process. I think that just my memory of articles written about that campaign is that it wasn't so crudely self-interested. The appeal to the national interest was bigger than in the recent.
What about the other players? We've got the role of the media. You talk about that in your book, the role of News Limited or media concentration. It could be another company. It happens to be News Limited with 70% of the print media.
Yeah, I say over 60. Some people say 70. I noticed Rupert Murdoch said it's more like 60 than 70.
Right.
So in the book, in Dog Days, I say over 60.
Okay.
But it's an extent of concentration that we wouldn't allow if they were selling soap powder or Weet-Bix. And what we're talking about here is not some minor commodity. It's the information that is an essential input into our democracy.
And the role of online media, this sort of atomisation, the so-called 24-hour media cycle, to what extent does that mitigate against informed discussion and debate?
Well, I think that's still evolving.
Yeah.
I don't know where that will end. Could end up a plus or a minus.
Yeah.
What you're doing here with Emmo is being done in different ways by different people. That's expanding the knowledge base, and in principle, that atomisation can lead to better informed. On the other hand, the proliferation of information outlets means that people can choose their news or choose their facts.
Yeah.
Tune into things they like to hear.
Yeah.
And it might make it harder to change people's minds.
This is an argument about Fox. I think they did it in the United States. They worked out who they wanted to watch Fox and then told them what they wanted to hear, and the audience said, we really like this station because their views are very similar to ours.
Yeah.
So it captured that group and alienated the rest, but that was more than enough to be a very good money-making proposition.
Yeah. Now, what the actual effect of that is on the policy-making process is quite complex.
It could mean a sharper partisan divide.
It certainly means that, and that's happened in the US.
Yeah.
People don't change their mind. Election after election, you get just about a 50-50 split.
Yes.
And it doesn't change state to state, election to election, except at the margin.
Yeah.
And that's because so many people are just listening to the news they want to hear.
Yes.
So that's a real challenge for a government wanting to reform in the public
Well, let
interest.
me ask the next logical question, and it happens to be about Clive Palmer, but it could be about any wealthy business person. At that last election, held just recently, there was disillusionment with Labor, there's no doubt about that. There was apprehension about the coalition. Therefore, it was ready-made for a third alternative. And Clive Palmer advertised very heavily right towards the end of that election campaign. I remember the campaign betting, the actual betting on different candidates and different parties actually had the Katter party doing okay, but they didn't have any money. In that last week, the Palmer party just poured the money in and got a pretty good result. 2 or 3 senators and Clive Palmer himself elected. I wonder if that's a product of this people herding in behind their political party and then someone else coming along and say, I'm an alternative, I've got a lot of money, vote for me. Either a positive alternative or, at the very least, a protest vote.
Yeah, I think we should be doing a lot of analysing.
Yeah.
Well, the political scientists and people who have the background properly to analyse these things. We should be putting a lot of work into this. It's a big threat to our democracy.
Yeah.
And the Palmer United Party introduces a number of new things into our democracy. One is the one you've mentioned. Another is conflict of interest. We haven't had before a member of our legislature with such direct conflicts of interest.
Doesn't seem to be uncommon in the US Congress, though. I mean, they seem to be quite heavily conflicted. Not every congressman or woman, but it's culturally here, we don't have it. We haven't had it.
Yeah.
Seems to be in the US, you know, they're running big businesses or chairing boards or on boards.
I don't know that.
Something I might look at in the future.
That's an important question. I'd be a bit surprised actually, because Mr. Palmer, a grand Australian, big figure in Australia, and he's entitled to play a role in public life, but he's still running businesses. His companies owe $8 million in carbon tax. Now, to his credit, I'll give Mr. Palmer this to his credit. He has acknowledged a conflict of interest, and he has said that he will treat discussion of this matter, of the matters in which he has a conflict, like the carbon tax, like the mining tax in the House of Representatives, as if it was discussion of a matter in which he had a conflict on a board of directors. He'll take himself out of the chamber for the discussion and the vote. That's the right thing to do. Where the difficult question comes is in the Senate. His vote actually doesn't matter in the House of Reps. It won't determine anything. The votes of his party may very well determine the outcome of determine the fate of carbon pricing, for example. And I say in Dog Days, I discuss this and say that Mr. Palmer is exactly right to recognise the conflict of interest in the House of Reps. You have the same conflict in the Senate, and it will be a taint on our democracy and if the carbon pricing is repealed on the votes of people who are conflicted.
Yeah, I understand. And if I could just say very quickly before a final question to you, I'm not being grumpy that Labor lost the election. I mean, you know, Labor was a divided party. Clive Palmer won the seat of Fairfax. Clive Palmer has got 2, maybe 3 senators. Good luck to him. It's just a matter of how you manage that in terms of your behaviour in the Parliament. But Ross, an offer that I could make to you is this: if you could change one thing in the world, what would you change?
Oh, the world's too big. I'd have peace in the Middle East. But let's talk about Australian policy. If there's one thing I could change in Australian policy, in the interests of the Abbott government, it would be the Prime Minister's commitment to implement every one of his promises, no matter what the conditions, because good government sometimes requires adjustment of policy once you recognise that circumstances are not the same as you thought they were.
So you're saying Australia would be better off if Tony Abbott as Prime Minister broke a number of his promises?
Yes, and the contrast between the Whitlam government and the Hawke government is instructive in this respect. Mr. Whitlam, in some ways to his credit, kept every promise.
Even with conditions changing.
When conditions were not as he expected them to be. And that was an important part of Australia entering 9 years of high unemployment and instability. I would hate that to happen again.
And it could, because we're dealing with the end of the boom, and there needs to be a recognition of that in government policy.
That's right, and we're only going to get out of these circumstances without high unemployment, a long period of instability, if we're quite disciplined in a wide range of areas, and loose ends here and there will bring us unstuck. And a government needs to be free to apply the right policy in the circumstances, notwithstanding electoral commitments to the contrary.
Well, thank you. In the national interest, thank you very much for joining us on Emmo Forum. Thanks, Ross.
Bye.
For Indonesia, the issue of what you might call irregular people movements is not a big deal.
Yeah.
In most of Southeast Asia,